Good evening, members, officers, and welcome to the Audit, Governance and Standards Committee. I've been advised there are no fire drills tonight, but if the alarm sounds, Mrs. Snook will ascertain the situation and provide further instructions. I'll remind you this meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Council's website. But will anyone else be recording or filming the proceedings? I just ask so that people at the meeting will know if this will be happening. Members who are using mobile phones or tablets are asked to please ensure these are on silent and are only being used with regard to the business on the agenda this evening. Good evening. Right, so moving to the agenda. Apologies for absence. I've received apologies for absence from Councillor Vizard. Are there any substitute members?
Mr. Chairman, Councillor Cox for Councillor Vizard.
Thank you, Councillor. I see no visiting members. Such is the attraction of this committee. Are there any disclosures by members or officers? Disappointingly, no. Are there any disclosures of lobbying? Reassuringly, no. I move that any items on the agenda be taken in public as proposed, as there are no exempt items on the agenda. Agreed, is it? Thank you. Okay, let's look at the minutes of the last meeting. Starting on page 1 of your papers. Is that agreed? Page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, and page 7. Now, with the committee's permission, I did just want to raise a point arising from the minutes on page 4. The last but one bullet point says the commercialisation agenda has now focused on housing and regeneration, having regard to lessons learned and appropriate mitigation. I can't believe I let that pass without referring to commercial property as being part of the commercialisation strategy. And with members' agreement, I would just like to include that item in the minutes. Is that agreed?
May I just ask a question, Mr. Chairman? You're saying you did refer to it during that?
I beg your pardon?
Are you saying you did actually refer to that?
I can't imagine I didn't, Councillor.
Okay, that's fine. I was just checking that's what you were saying.
Yes.
In that case, yes, by all means.
Because it's uppermost in my mind that our commercialisation strategy should continue to involve commercial property. Does the Head of Finance agree with that, that we should... Fine. Thank you, Debbie. Could you make a note of that?
10 minutes agreed, subject to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I note that Councillor Garland has just joined the meeting. Good evening, Councillor. Nice of you to be here. Moving on to agenda item 8, the Internal Audit and Assurance Plan. Who am I handing over to? Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll run through the report briefly with the committee, and happy to take any questions as I go, or save to the end as the committee wishes. What you have in front of you is the paper that sets out the results of the planning process that we began late last year to consider the appropriate audit response to the risks and challenges facing Maidstone Borough Council over 2017-18. Our aim as an internal audit service is to work towards delivering an opinion on the Council's internal control, risk and governance. And what you have in front of you is our programme by which we intend to examine those risks, review project work at the Council and provide additional governance support, working towards both delivering that opinion and supporting the Council's wider governance aims. After a preamble referring to the audit standards through to pages 17 on the papers, page 18 sets out the level of resources that we have available to us as an audit service this year, which principally as a result of efficiencies within the team, pardon me, represents a slight increase on those that were available in 2016-17. That is, as per custom, divided between the 4 authorities that form part of our partnership in proportion to their contribution to our budget. Moving on to page 19 and on 20 is some more consideration, as I am required to do as a head of audit, into whether the level of resources that has been made available to me is adequate to allow me to complete the programme of work. In broad summary, I am satisfied that it provides the level of resources that's appropriate to me. As part of that consideration, I took a look at the number of audit days across the 42 district councils in South East England, and although, say, that graph on page 20, the dots are really quite splayed out, so I'm not sure I learned any great mysteries as a result of undertaking that work. I am satisfied, nevertheless, that the level of resources that we have is not inconsistent with those councils who share characteristics with Maidstone. And so I'm content to recommend to members this evening that the level of resources I've been provided with is adequate to do the work I'm asked to complete. Moving on to, moving on to page 21 onwards, we're looking at some of the broader governance tasks that we're asked to undertake on areas such as risk management, counter-fraud, supporting members with activities such as the briefing on the annual governance statement that many of you have attended earlier this evening, and our work on audit planning. I'll run through that in more detail on pages 21 and 22. The one thing I would like to highlight to members is at the top of page 22, which is that we're looking to expand our role with respect to supporting the Council's counter-fraud arrangements in 2017, driven in large part by forthcoming changes to the standards we're required to adopt by SIPFA. We're expecting those new standards during 17-18, which provides a great opportunity, we think, to revisit the Council's approach across the counter-fraud domain. Page 24, moving on to the projects, the individual assurance projects we undertake. That diagram includes, as an overall summary, an indication of the type of risk assessment process that we go through, considering what's called the audit universe, all of the various areas which we could examine over in any one year, subjecting them to a risk assessment, considering their size, their prominence within the Council's priorities, our previous audit findings, the extent of external review by third bodies, and a number of other factors. And what this gives us ultimately is a draft project list that we then, as required by standards, consult with across a wide range of officers to produce what is on pages 25 to 27, which is the list of proposed assurance projects that we intend to undertake across the year. For each, there's an indication of how many days of staff input we estimate will be appropriate to complete that level of work. That is very much an estimate at this stage and something that will be determined in more detail once we get beneath these headlines and start scoping out the work in detail in consultation with officers nearer the time that the work's scheduled to complete. One aspect to highlight there in particular is that the Council is engaged in a number of partnerships across Mid-Kent services, and so services such as its payroll are shared with Swale Borough Council. We tend to undertake those reviews in partnership with those other authorities, and so we'll look at payroll, to use that example again, at Maidstone and Swale, and report the results to audit committees at both boroughs, in which way the Council gets a broader audit coverage for a reduced number of audit days. This, working through to page 27, gives us a full accounting for the audit days that were available to us in 2017-18. Beyond that, on page 28 is a diagram that I hope's printed off legibly, which sets out some other issues on audit's radar, referring to here. These are issues which, for various reasons, won't have met the criteria for examination in 17-18, either because they're subject to change or we're uncertain exactly how they'll pan out at this point. But they are nevertheless areas where we have them in mind, we'll keep them under review, and as circumstances become clearer as arrangements become surer, they'll become more prominent contenders for audit examination as plans go from year to year. And then finally, across pages 29 and 30, some more information about, having set out our projects, how we go about delivering that work and monitoring the quality of the work that we undertake, including the performance indicators that we report back to you as members of twice a year. And that leaves us with two appendices to the report. The first is that aforementioned audit universe, which sets out across 4 or 5 pages all of the areas which were potential areas for examination in 17-18, along with some information about when we last looked at those areas, what we found when we did, and any further comments that may be of interest to explain the sequencing and the ordering. And then finally, across appendices 2 and B and C, some biographies of the team who work with me to deliver that work. We've got a very experienced and very skilled team I'm very proud to have working with us at Mid-Kent Audit, that have a range of skills and experience that cross really all the domains of the local authority area and produce what is a high quality, in my view, audit product which has been recognised as such by our fully conforming review from the Institute of Internal Audit a couple of years ago. So that's something of a gallop through the report, but I'm happy to take any questions that people have obviously left till the end rather than interrupting me.
Thank you, Rich. Before we take questions, it was remiss of me not to ask Councillor Garland when he arrived whether he had been lobbied on any of the matters. Just as a formality, Councillor? No. And what? No interest. No interests? No, he doesn't look at all interested. Anyway, enough frivolity. Thanks for that. Thanks for presenting this report. I must say it's a very good-looking report, and congratulations on presentation, if nothing else. And we'll now go and look at the meat of it. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, Chairman, first of all, I wanted to say on the presentation, I think it's a tremendous step forward. It's much easier to read, and it's very pretty in places, isn't it, actually? I don't know, it takes an awful lot of ink, but never mind. We'll take that aside. I'd just like to know, please, if you could just outline a little bit the differences in the words that you use in describing the method, not the methodology, but the outcomes of your audits. I'm quite interested to know what is the difference between weak and limited, for example, because I understand both terms, but not in terms of actually what I would call declension. So I'd like to know that. And then after you've described that, if I might come back with another question, Chairman. Thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to. The change is really brought about by, in 2014, we revised our assurance ratings, and so what you'll see is the word limited falling out of use in 2014, and largely but not entirely being replaced by the word weak. In terms of the practicalities of the definition, weak is more of an acknowledgement that the service may be effective in some areas, but that its effectiveness is not universal, and there are areas of the service which fall beneath the standards that the Council would expect, and it requires support to help get up to a level where it's sound or strong. So it's not a precise read across from limited to weak, but they have enough equivalence that I was happy to use the same colour to describe them.
Thank you. Well, in the case of Section 106 agreements, to have weak against that is something which I find a bit concerning, because Section 106 agreements are an agreement between the Council and the developers, particularly in the supply of money for a variety of things. And I've got a funny feeling that in the past we've not been as sharp as perhaps we should have been with regard to making sure those monies are available, to the point where some developers have a funny habit of disappearing, as you probably are aware, only to arrive as phoenixes the week after as something else. But when it's weak in the 106 agreements, I am concerned, because that money is very, very essentially required to do a lot of things. So I hope that steps are being taken in that regard to bolster that. And there's just one more question, Chairman, and that is the question of the counter-fraud. I brought this up before. I'm always interested in knowing how clever the people who are trying to get away with things are and how winkling can get on. You know, you winkle them out one way or another. I get the feeling, and I would hope to have some confirmation of this, that where various people get together these days in a variety of ways, there are all sorts of benefits and things. I think there's a lot of cross-information going on now, that you're getting information from a variety of sources. And in that regard, I would suspect this is why you need those extra days to follow up these leads. Is that correct?
Well, dealing with that question first, as you rightly indicate, there are a number of data matching initiatives. The National Fraud Initiative is the most prominent, but there's also a local variant called the Kent Intelligence Network that does, as you rightly say, compare various data sources to identify potentials where you've got an individual claiming housing benefit to neighbouring authorities, or someone claiming a small business rate relief on business rates when they actually own a property elsewhere in Kent, and those type of matches. The NFI exercise reported outturn just last month and put forward a little over 2,000 matches for us to investigate. And so that's what we're tasked with doing over the next couple of years. So there is increasingly sophisticated, as you would hope, attempts to catch what are increasingly sophisticated frauds. But, as you say, in looking at those matches and investigating those matches takes up a significant portion of the work that we'll be undertaking there. To take your first question on Section 106, I agree with you about its importance to the Council's financial affairs. The report that we did there actually reported in June or July of last year and was summarised in our interim report that came to this committee in December. That had a number of recommendations for improvement for the service, which the service accepted and is working towards. We will report to members in our annual report in July how successfully the service has been able to implement those recommendations.
Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. A general question, I think I may have asked this before. This is a very good, very clearly presented report. I agree with my colleagues. There's a lot of work here, and it's just I want to get a feel around the relationship between the work you do and the external auditors, because it seems to be there is a link. Certainly in my industry experience, the internal audit and the external audit do work quite closely together. And I'd just like to get a bit more of a feel on that. The other question is a bit more specific. It's on page 21, and it's other assurance work, and it's a number of days. And just noticed that your outturn figure for 2016-17, under contingency, you've got quite an exceptional figure there, and I'm just wondering what that represented. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. On the relationship between internal and external audit, you're right, we do cover similar ground, similar areas, and we do work closely together. The external audit, rather, I should say, visiting the Council in the past few weeks, and I had, as I do every year, a set of questions to fill out to convey to the external auditors what findings we've had in our work and the extent to which they influence the specific reviews that external audit undertake. In terms of the specific assurance from one to the other, that's lesser now than once it was, mainly because the standards under which we operate have diverged to an extent, to a degree that if Grant Thornton wanted to rely specifically on a piece of work that we'd done, they would have to re-perform such a large part of it that it would represent only very minimal saving to Grant Thornton doing the work themselves. That being said, we do still have a role to play in giving assurance to Grant Thornton on the overall quality of the Council's control environment and its governance, and they are aspects that Grant Thornton will no doubt take into account when they are looking at things like sample sizes, materiality, and scheduling the programme of work that they undertake. If you wanted to add anything. Yeah. Okay. Excuse me. And dealing specifically with your question on the outturn days of contingency, there's been two particular programmes of work we've been looking through in 2016-17. One is an expansive review into health and safety, which was commissioned by the authority and was reported to members back in December. The other is an investigation following a referral to us, which came initially through a whistleblowing route. Neither of those things we would expect to recur in 17-18, and so they're both worked out of the numbers to an extent. But it's in the nature of a contingency budget that its spend could be higher or lower than you anticipated. It represents our best guess, but sometimes events occur that you have to pursue, which can increase the liability there.
Councillor English.
Yes, may I share Councillor Daly's comment that this is an extremely attractively presented and readable report. I like this sort of Ptolemaic universal figure there. It's quite interesting. To pursue the couple of points that come up, sort of, in terms of Section 106, of course, Councillor Perry and myself and other members of the Planning Committee have been addressing this, but it's not just the planning service where the problem has been, just to make that point. It is elsewhere in the council as well. But the main point I was going to raise is, you've just referred to, we have a couple of points here under, you've got health and safety, and also register of interest, which are both flagged up as weak. Now, generally, these issues might bring us into conflict if we don't deal with them properly. Other regulatory compliances outside of audit. For example, health and safety legislation is if we're not complying with that for whatever reason, or we're not able to tell whether we're complying with it because the reporting is, shall we say, ambiguous, we could be in some difficulty. So can I be reassured that it says here next review 2018-19 for health and safety, and the same for 19 for 20 for the register of interest. Now, there is particular legal and regulatory requirements with those. Can I be assured that we are not going to be in any danger of not complying with those because we're not doing a report for some time?
Firstly, on the specifics, there isn't a specific regulatory requirement in either area to have internal audit review the arrangements, and so there's no external certification or regulatory compliance which depends solely upon an internal audit review of this nature. The reason that we don't typically have a week report followed up with another report the immediate next year is because obviously we would have left with a number of recommendations. And so over a period of time following the issue of the report, our work will be focused on assessing the implementation of those recommendations, which can sometimes take a number of months into the new year. On health and safety, a lot of those recommendations are falling due at the end of this month. And so we will be coming back to assess the implementation of those recommendations within the next few weeks, and we'll be reporting the results to members once our annual report is available in July. On the register of interests, I should clarify that the register of interests we were particularly focused on in 14-15 was the arrangements by which officers declared interest rather than members. With respect to members' arrangements for declaring interest, we found those to be sound or possibly even strong from recollection, but we found that the arrangements for officers to declare interest weren't up to the same mark. What the Council has done since then is sought to address the recommendations, and so what we tend to do once the recommendations are addressed is upgrade our rating internally to sound in most cases, and we look at it again when next its turn comes up through the risk assessment. Now, this risk assessment is something that we do keep under review, and so sitting here today right now knowing what I know, I'm satisfied that by looking at the register of interests for officers next in 1920, we won't have subjected the Council to undue risk by not having looked at it in the meantime. That assessment could change if facts change, and if they do, materially change, we may bring further updates of the plan back to this committee.
Thank you very much. That's very reassuring, and I think that's very useful to know that the reporting, particularly on health and safety, is so, so near. Thank you very much.
You might make a note to bring that issue back up again in about 9 months' time, then. Right. Yeah. Councillor Atkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going back to Section 106 agreements here. Debbie sent us a sort of supplementary list to the agenda with a list of agreements for testing. We don't actually know the outcomes of these agreements. I mean, obviously, I'm particularly interested in Case 2 land at Gatland House, because that's in my constituency, in my ward. It would be interesting to know what the outcomes were. And then there's 3 more after that. The spend dates have long since expired. Does that mean we're just going to send that money back? And my final point is, attached to the Planning Committee's papers last week, page 112, there's an allocation under a planning application for the wildlife site at Fant. Do you actually actively contact people like Fant Wildlife to actually make sure this money is spent? So that's my Section 106. Thank you.
Would you take what you can of those?
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned before, we originally reported our findings on the Section 106 review back in December, and that sparked a significant range of comments from members, which is largely why you have that additional supplementary sheet you have with you this evening that Debbie forwarded earlier last week, was to deal with some of those queries. I don't have the detailed information with me tonight that would enable me to answer your specific questions, Councillor Atkinson, but as I think Debbie put in the, or hope Debbie was put in the covering email, I'm happy to deal with any specific questions on that paper in correspondence. So if I would be happy to answer any questions you have on a reply.
If you look at the agenda for last Thursday's Planning Committee meeting, there is a fairly comprehensive update of the current position with the Section 106s. It is intended to discuss the whole issue at the next meeting of the Planning Committee, as Councillor Perry, as Chairman, can confirm.
Are you happy with that, Councillor Atkinson? Okay. Councillor Garland.
Pretty or not, this looks like a sensible report, reads like a sensible report, and I can't see anything glaringly missing from the projects list, so I'd like to move recommendations, please, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. You had a comment you wanted to make, Councillor.
I was just willing to second that and move on. Thank you very much.
Did you not indicate earlier? Do you want to say anything?
Thank you very much. I'd like to refer to the diagram on page 20, this scatter diagram, and I certainly agree there's not a strong correlation. And in fact, in paragraph 16, where it says there is a general trend towards larger authorities having greater audit provision, I'm not at all clear that that is supported by the diagram. And also, I'm guessing that many activities of a local authority are common, whatever the size. Therefore, looking at it in terms of absolute spend on internal audit, Maidstone is positioned about in the middle, which is fine. But I was wondering, have you had any opportunity to benchmark yourself against 2 or 3 or 4 of these, and in particular to check whether the figures on page 18 about chargeability, 70%, 72%, are they reasonable? Are you exceeding what others do? Are you spending too much time on admin? So it's benchmarking and checking that your level of spend is reasonable compared to some of your peers. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Benchmarking is something I'm very keen on doing, not least because we're working in an area which is sort of between art and science is exactly how much resources you need and where those resources are best focused. It's a professional judgment, and professional judgment is always best informed by a wealth of evidence. With respect to benchmarking, I'm currently chairman of Kent Audit Group, so I meet with my head of audit peers across Kent. I'm on the executive board of the London Audit Group, so I meet with heads of audit in London authorities as well, and I'm also a SIPFA associate, so I present training for SIPFA across the country, talking to other heads of audit. Not everybody calculates chargeability in the same way. Some people don't calculate it at all. For those who calculate it in broadly the same sort of way that we do, typically you're looking at numbers between 65 and 75%. So I'm content, pending new evidence, that 72% represents a good amount of time to spend on advancing the plan. I mean, I wouldn't say that 28% is entirely simply admin. It also includes the time we spend training our staff, which is an important activity to help keep up their skills. But I'm satisfied from that benchmarking that we are consistent with our peer groups and delivering an effective service.
Final one, now I'm guessing you'll want to move on to the vote. In the scatter diagram, the range by eye looks like 125 through 575k. Presumably, in the various bodies that you're in, being blunt, you try to understand why some are so high and why some are so low and why you are where you are.
I mean, that's absolutely right. As I said, this is new research for the purposes of this report, so this isn't widely heralded or discussed information. What I have avoided saying is that anybody in this scatter graph is in the wrong position. They will all have taken their own view as to the risks that are appropriate to their authorities, and they will, in the light of that risk assessment, come to a view that they need 120 audit days or 575 audit days or any point in between. What this does tell me is that Maidstone, as an authority within this area, has an amount of audit days which doesn't leave it as an outlier, such that I would feel the need to explain to my peer group why Maidstone is where it is, so much as New Forest may do, for instance.
Okay, well, in moving to the recommendations, I would just like to say a few words about what we're being asked to approve here. There's quite a daunting task of audit projects listed that are to be carried out in this coming year. And I think it would be worthwhile the committee just hearing from Rich, and for the benefit of those watching on webcast who don't have the papers in front of them, what the selection process was in reducing what could be 100 to 200 activities to about 50. Would you mind just doing that for us, Rich, before we take this to the vote?
I'm happy to, Chairman. So the flowchart on page 24 sets out the headlines of it. But as a starting point, we consider the range of activities that audit could potentially undertake, which is this audit universe. We do that by looking at sources such as the Council's risk profiles, its budget book, our own work from previous years across, and also the work that we undertake across the 4 authorities that we serve, but also in producing that scatter graph, I also had the privilege of reading 42 other audit plans and learning what sorts of areas they covered. So having defined the range of possible activities we might undertake, when we then put them through this risk assessment filter, considering the level of spend in each area, the extent to which the Council's priorities are dependent upon success in that area, the risk of fraud that an area incurs, the type of oversight that an area might have. If it has an external regulator, for instance, that would tend to reduce the level of work that we would need to undertake. The level of change that an area is going through, an area which has just had a restructure or a new policy or new legislative requirements would find itself higher up our priority list. And then finally, we consider our audit knowledge, what we have learned from looking at that area in previous years, what our colleagues have learned from looking at similar areas across Kent. And that feeds through a mathematical process which ultimately gives us a starting point for what would be in the 17-18 audit plan. We then have that draft project list. We take that show on the road, as it were, to go and speak to heads of service across Maidstone and all the other authorities we work with. They'll help inform our risk assessment. They'll tell us where maybe the change that we thought was coming isn't going to come as soon as we thought, or it's going to come later. This is also an opportunity for heads of service to highlight to us any particular programmes where they might feel that audit assurance would be beneficial to them. And in this way, we end up whittling down and refining the project list to the list that you see before you this evening. Those other areas in the audit universe aren't discarded entirely. We consider what we've learned and when they might next be have merit in being examined, and that's what you see in Appendix A. And then we refer back to the level of resources that we had and make sure that the two aren't too far askance, that we can undertake all of the work that we feel is necessary to undertake in 1718.
Thank you for that. I think, Committee, that was well worth saying, because we're being asked to approve these list of projects, and coming at it cold, as you might have done, you might well have wondered how have we arrived at this and why aren't we doing other things. So I think it's important that we do know a depth of work has gone into arriving at this list. So thank you, Rich, and thank you for all the work you've put into it. It's nice to know it isn't just pretty pictures. Okay, let's move to recommendations. I'll take these one at a time. The first one, that the committee approves the audit and assurance plan for 1718. Is that agreed? We note the longer-term issues recorded by the Mid-Kent audit. Agreed. The committee endorses the view of the head of audit partnership that the plan sets out sufficient resource to complete a work programme leading to a head of audit opinion on the Council's internal controls, risk management and governance. Do we endorse that? And the committee finally notes the head of audit partnership's assurance that the plan is compiled independently and without inappropriate influence from management. Okay, that's noted. Thank you very much. Let's move on. Okay, so agenda item 9, we've got the external auditor's progress report, which is attached. Would you like to address this, Darren?
Thank you, Chairman. Very briefly, it is what it says on the tin. It's a progress report. The first half just sets out where we currently are in the audit cycle, and then the rest of the report highlights developments in the sector for your information. Happy to take any questions members may have.
Do members have any questions?
I don't have any questions. I just would like to say that it's a very clear and well-presented report, and thank you very much for that. It's so clear that I don't need to ask anything.
Well, that was short and sweet, wasn't it? We're asked on page 40 to note the external auditor's progress report attached to Appendix A. Is that noted? Agreed? Moving on to agenda item 10. Again, Darren, you going to talk to this? Mark, rather, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. So this paper is the audit plan, and it's our first formal communication with you as the Audit Committee and Governance Committee, and as those charged with governance as defined under the International Standards of Auditing. Its prime purpose is to inform you of those potential risks that we foresee and those risks where we intend to undertake more audit work. And we set that within the context of the developments in the sector, and more specifically some of your challenges and opportunities as an authority. In addition to that, we also define for you materiality. So that gives you an indication of what we consider to be significant, and where, if we do detect errors or omissions, the level at which we will report back to you. And then finally, this paper also highlights what work we intend to do to assess your arrangements to ensure value for money with the resources that you have at your disposal. Thank you, Chairman.
Anybody got any questions on this? I note there's a reassuring number of sentences saying our work has identified no material weaknesses which are likely to adversely affect on the Council's financial statements, which is encouraging. Anybody want to raise any matters on this? We'll wait for the meat, shall we?
I'll just formally propose that we note the report, Mr. Chairman. Again, it's very clear and straightforward and well presented.
Seconded. Thank you, John. Sorry, is that agreed? Okay. Thank you, Darren. Agenda item 11 on page 83. The latest risk assessment of the budget strategy. Would you like to address this, Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The role of the committee is about considering risk, and so at your last meeting, you'll remember that you looked at the risks around the budget strategy and had quite a detailed discussion about those. You also requested at that meeting that we bring back the budget strategy risks to subsequent meetings so you could see how risks changed over a period of time. So that's what this report's doing. It's updating the budget strategy risk assessment that we made. And rather than go through all of the budget risks, given that you considered those last time, what I suggest you focus on is the things that have changed over the past couple of months, which are set out on page 85. So the risk in this table is on the left-hand side, and then there's a number of things that have happened which are in the column headed factor considered. So maybe most importantly of all, the Council agreed a balanced budget for 2017-18, and there's a number of other things that have happened that arguably could affect the risk assessment. And in the right-hand column, I've put the implications for the risk profile. And most of them have either no change or just a very small impact, I'd suggest, on the risk profile. The one thing that I think probably does affect the overall risk profile is on commercialisation. Now, the risk with commercialisation is that commercial activities don't, in fact, deliver the expected level of income. And what's happened over the past couple of months is that we've reported a budget overspend on the Moat Park Cafe, which is one of a number of commercialisation projects. And unfortunately, I think this demonstrates an increased likelihood of failing to deliver the expected level of income from commercial activities. Having said that, on this specific instance, we have put plans in place to address the issue with Moat Park Cafe. Having experimented with running it in-house, the decision has been made to outsource running of the cafe. Cafe will continue to run under current management through the summer to give us time to identify a third-party provider. But the plan is to go to the market to look for an organisation to run the cafe. The in-house operation can bid to run it, but we'll be able to compare their bid with bids from external providers. So I think we've got measures in place to mitigate the risk, but it was right, I think, to highlight that as something potentially increasing the risk. So what the effect of that is can be shown on the table on page 89, where the different risks are plotted out on this matrix showing impact on one axis and likelihood on the other. And the one I've just talked about, commercialisation, G, has moved up in terms of likelihood from 2 to 3. So still in the amber band, but a slightly higher level of risk. The recommendation is that you note that updated risk assessment. I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have on the assessment of the different risks or any other comments that you may have. Thank you.
Anybody got any comments? Councillor Cooling.
Thank you very much, Mark. In terms of the delivery of planned savings J, which is still in the red zone, I mean, when do you feel, and we're towards the end of the financial year, and presumably people have now managers have looked at their resources, people resources, their commitments. When do you think, with a following wind, that delivery of planned savings, there'll be more confidence attached to it so it comes out of the red zone?
We'll be looking at the plans for delivering 17-18 savings early in the new financial year, and quite separately from Audit Committee, we'll be reporting at the first meeting of Policy and Resources of the new municipal year in June on that. So I would hope that we'll have established that there are plans in place to deliver those savings, and we'll be able to reassess that risk. Certainly, it is absolutely fundamental that budget savings are delivered. So right from the beginning of the year, we'll be looking at that. We won't wait till halfway through the year to see how we're getting on that one.
This is just an observation, not a question. I'm probably the only one, but I still cannot get used to seeing A, B and H in here, because they are dependent upon delivery or non-delivery against other risks. I think they're dependent variables rather than independent, but it's just me perhaps.
These risks are related to one another. I don't think you can look at any of them entirely in isolation, so I accept that there are links between them.
Councillor Garland surprised me.
What with? On page 85, at the top of it, it says failure to deliver a balanced budget agreed by Council for 2017-18, and the likelihood of failing to deliver a balanced budget has been reduced slightly. Now, given that we're legally required to deliver a balanced budget, and for years we have delivered a balanced budget, what specifically has led to a reduction in the likelihood of not delivering a balanced budget when actually legally you can't?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a sort of a fine point. I mean, the only concern that I think members should have is about the future. On the projections that went to Council on 1st of March, we've got balanced budget for 17-18, projecting a balanced budget for 18-19 as well. The problem arises from 1920 onwards, and certainly from 2020 when, as I'm sure you all know, local government is going to be faced with a new system of funding. We've got a lot of uncertainty. So, yes, we're looking as though we're in quite a strong position for the next couple of years, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't start thinking about what may happen in subsequent years.
On that basis, if it's a fine point, and you're absolutely right in what you say, oh, sure, you know your stuff, then the likelihood should just remain as it is. It doesn't really matter to me, but it's just a small point, but likelihood is much the same, really. Maybe slightly increased, given what you said at the end of the MTFS period that we're looking at.
Forgive me, Councillor, you did surprise me. I thought you were just going to move the recommendation.
Oh, no, I moved the recommendations.
Before you do, Councillor English wants to come in.
Well, it's just on that. I am struggling with this whole point. I think I did say this at the pre-meeting in terms of this failure to deliver a balanced budget. Given that we are legally required so to do, and that even Liverpool under Derek Hatton was legally required in the end to do so. I just don't see how we could fail to deliver it and how it could be a risk, because it could mean that delivering it would mean everything else in there becomes a risk, and we might end up with insufficient balances or inability, or have to deliver more planned savings than, well, more savings of an unplanned nature, shall we say. But I don't see how we could have a risk not to reach a balanced budget, because we're legally required to do that, whatever else we do. So I can't see how it could go up and down, because it's an absolute legal requirement.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is a difference, which Rich has just pointed out, between setting a balanced budget, which is what we've done, and then actually making sure that we deliver against that.
Surely that's a different indicator, isn't it? Or it should be, because the two things are different.
We are talking about delivery here.
But the actual indicator in here says set. It doesn't say, doesn't it? It says failure to deliver a balanced budget in that sense means that, I thought, in terms of what has been recorded here in the table, certainly implies that we're actually talking about setting the budget rather than delivering it. I think there is a need to make that somewhat more of a distinction, because the two entries actually say the same thing, and perhaps the entry 1 should be amended to say failure to set a balanced budget, and the second entry on table 85 should be the different wording, because you've got two entries saying the same thing, and I think there should be two.
Yes, I take the point that we could be more accurate in the use of words and make that distinction between setting and delivering a budget. Thank you.
Okay. Can I move to the recommendation? Oh, sorry, Councillor.
I'm sorry I'm a late comer to the feast. I'm just looking at the commercialisation side of it, Chairman. I have to say that my years in Maidstone and other places in council ways, every time when I get involved with councils getting involved in commercial activity, I get the jitters. We used to joke about people running whelk stalls and not being able to make money on it. Here we are, 40% of the amount of money set aside to cover losses have been taken up, it appears, in almost 1 year. Now, I don't know how long the Moat Park establishment was running at a loss. I've got no idea more than the man in the moon. All I know is that steps have been taken to withdraw. Probably that's a good thing. I do hope that we can find somebody that can make some money out of it and enjoy life, as it were, by us getting rid of it. But I do concern myself, really, when I hear these things. How many other commercial activities do we have lurking around that might fall into the same category in a very short space of time, bearing in mind that we're not very good at running things commercially?
What we've done over the past few months is to refocus the commercialisation strategy towards housing and regeneration projects, and I hope that there's now a better understanding in the Council of what skills we have as a Council and those areas where we need to bring in outside expertise because we don't have the skills. So with the housing and regeneration projects, there is a fair amount of knowledge in-house, but equally on a project like the Moat Park Adventure Zone, we recognise that we don't necessarily have all of the skills in-house, so we're using an external agent to source the contractors that we need to develop that. So I think it's about us as a council having an awareness of what we're good at and what we're not so good at. Obviously, we slipped up with the Moat Park Cafe, but I hope with a better self-awareness of what we can and cannot do, we will not fall into that trap again.
Thank you, Dan. We have asked, I'll just remind members, we have asked for this update to come to all of our meetings our audit meeting. So we'll get a regular update on how these risks are progressing. So, yes, Councillor Cooling.
Apologies, I was looking for a hook to raise something. You may have ruled this totally out of order, but following on commercialisation, perhaps outsourcing, Debbie Snook's email of the 16th also gave a listing of the 10 largest contracts. Now, please stop me if I'm out of order here. 10 largest contracts. Looking at it, I think what this committee wanted, was it 2 meetings ago, was a feel for what the monitoring, the routine service monitoring arrangements were under these contracts. The fundamental requirement for an outsourcing contract is to have a good monitoring regime. And in a sense, I applaud the list that's given here, but I don't think it quite gives us the width of understanding that each of these are under strong management overview. Thank you.
Well, no, you raise a very, very good point. It's not actually on the agenda tonight as such, but if you have a suggestion, then it can go on the agenda. Let me just let Rich respond to you first of all.
I mean, the paper that you have is a summary of the audit work that we've done, and so it does provide, from an audit perspective, a degree of consideration of the effectiveness of the monitoring arrangements where those arrangements have been subject to audit review in the recent past. What you will have on the plan that you've approved just a few moments ago is that we are intending to undertake a review of the Council's contract management arrangements that perhaps will more precisely examine the questions that Councillor Cooling raises. That's work that we scheduled in 17-18 and we'll report our findings to members in due course.
If I could just add to that, the outcomes of the audit work that Rich has reported, I think, do demonstrate a need for focus on this area. So we're not, from a management point of view, we're not going to wait for the audit that Rich has talked about. I think it's important that we put in place certain minimum standards for contract management, and so we're organising training for managers who've got responsibility for contracts, and we're going to look at ways that we can at least achieve a minimum standard. What I think is the case in Maidstone, as probably the audit results show, is that we've got a pattern of some very good contract management and monitoring, some not so good, but we want to get everybody up to a certain minimum standard, and we'll be looking to do that.
Absolutely applaud what we've just heard. You're perhaps asking for a suggestion for the next meeting. If we could have, please, an update in greater width. Pick, instead of these 10, pick 5. Give us an illustration of what you're expecting the service management to actually take part in as a regulatory regime for each of these contracts, so that for what our comments are worth, we may be able to offer comment on that.
So we'll ask for an update report on progress on this particular project of contract management per se, and if there's some examples in there that can give you reassurance, then so much the better. Is that all right, members?
I think it's very important, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, can I now go to the recommendation on page 83? We're asked to note the updated risk assessment of the budget strategy provided in Appendix A. Is that noted, members? Thank you. I guess you've all had a look at the work programme. Has anybody got any comments on that? Sorry, Councillor Daly? Right. Councillor English.
I'm assuming, because of where we are in the municipal year, that we are not scheduling an assessment of benefits of investors in people during this current year. But it is still down here technically as a TBA.
What are you requesting, that it's removed from the work programme?
Well, it's a bit pointless at this stage of the year to have it in there, isn't it? Because we've virtually finished this municipal year. So I don't think we'll be scheduling it until the new year. So might as well take it out.
Well, as it stays as a TBA, it'll hang on, won't it?
Will it automatically move forward to the new municipal year? In that case, I shall return to it in May and suggest we get rid of it at that point.
Councillor Cox.
On my committee, in Employment Committee, we have also raised it to come back to the next meeting to look at the validity of it, how it's done, how it represents what we're doing, and indeed how the way forward and what we should do. So from one committee to the other, we will give our views to yours.
That's very kind of you. That would be much appreciated. Thank you. Okay, if there's no other business, I'll close the meeting. Thank you very much.